Hello everyone. For this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to create non-predefined exception in using PL/SQL. So if you're going to create a non-predefined exception, so you need to declare a variable for your exception. So let's call it E underscore my exception, for example. Then of course the data type will be an exception. And then let's put first the begin and end block. So then we will be doing DML command. So insert into departments. And then let's put a the column. So I'll be inserting the department table. So department ID and department name. And then values. So for now, I will be putting a literal value. So 280, and then I'll give the department name as null. So in this DML statement, we will be inserting 280 department ID with a null department name, and the department table has a not null constraint on this column. So it will throw us an exception, and the exception that will be thrown is not predefined. So let's try to run this one. I will my declaration here will not be used, so we can comment this out first. Then let's run it. Then here you have the Oracle error 01400, which states that you cannot insert null into a column that has a, of course, not null constraint. So as you can see, this is a non-predefined. It means that there's no predefined name for the Aura-01400 error or exception. So we will be creating our own name for this one so that we can call it or reference it in our exception block later. So with this one, if you're going to declare a non-predefined exception, so you need to call the prigma init exception. So you need to call the prigma exception init to initialize our own kind of exception. So first will be the exception variable we created. So this will be our exception name, and then the code for that exception. So dash 01400. So this will, instead of putting the race exception in the others block or reference it as others, so we can call our created exception to do that. So before we do that, I'll show you how to handle it using the others. So you just need to put the exception block here, and then when others. So since it is not predefined, so it will fall in this clause or statement, and then dbms. Let's just output the a message output that put line, put underscore line, then failed to insert. We just put some random message here. So let's run this again. Yeah. So since the not null constraint will run on this one, so there will be an error. And then since the aura 01400 is not predefined, so it doesn't have a name, so it will fall under the others statement in the exception part of the code or exception section of the code. So if we create our own exception, so we can reference it here. So when, then call your exception, then put your message here, failed to insert due to not null constraint, for example. So let's run this. And since we already reference our exception here, and we initialize it in this part, so when the exception or error is raised, it will fall in this clause, not here. So let's run this again. So terminate, we have some error here. Terminating string. Exception then. And others then. Prigma exception init. So Prigma. Why Prigma? It's Pragma. Sorry. So Pragma exception init. So let's run this one. So there you have it. Failed to insert due to not null constraint. So we already reference our own kind of exception, or our own exception variable instead of falling it to others. So this is how you handle or create a non-predefined exception on your own to reference it. So next, we will be having a user-defined exception. So user-defined exception allows you to raise your own kind of exception and catch it or handle it in the exception section based on the requirements of your PLSQL program or your script. So there are times that some constraints only exist in a certain business rules. For example, department ID should be a 3-digit integer. So if you insert a 1-digit, it will be okay. However, in your business rule, it should be 3-digit, something like that. So you can create your own kind of exception to handle this one. For example, I will put the constraint that department ID should be always in 3-digit. So we will raise our own exception if the value to be inserted in the department ID is not in a format of 3-digit. So I will use the same exception here. So I will make this user-defined exception. So this will be user-defined exception. So if you will be using the raised, you don't need to use the pragma here. So we will be inserting values to the department. However, I will put this one inside a variable. So let's create a dep ID variable with a value of 27 example, data type number, and then values. And then we have dep name. So dep name will be something like, let's say, IT, IT department. So this will be varchar and give it a 20. So before we begin the insert, so we can put an if here. So if our dep ID, so 3-digit, less than 100, or dep ID is greater than 999, then so we can raise our own exception here. So we just need to call the raise statement. So raise and then our exception. So I will be using the my exception again. And then and if, so this will automatically raise an exception if the condition has been met. And this will be dep ID. And this will be dep name. So let's fail to insert due to department dep ID. Let's say dep ID value. Yeah. So this should raise an exception since our department ID here is not in a 3-digit format. So let's try to run this one. So as you can see, guys, our exception, our user-defined exception has been raised here. So since we put value of 27 and as we said earlier, our dep ID should be in between or in 3-digit format. So another way of creating your user-defined exception is by using the raised application error. So using the raised application error, it allows you to create an exception as same format as the predefined exception. Since our predefined exception has a error code and error message, so we can also do that with our user-defined exception. So to do that, instead of raised, we will be using the raised application error. So raised application error. Yeah, so raised application error. And then open and close parentheses. The first parameter will be the error code you will be using for your user-defined exception. So to create an error code, you can use the negative 20,000 to negative 20,999 or negative 20,000 to negative 20,999. So these are reserved range of number for user-defined error code. So let's see, I will be using negative 20,222, for example. And then next one is you need to put your error message. So my error message that the part ID value is not in 3-digit format. So this will be my error code and error message. So since you will be using the raise application error, so we need to reference this error code to our exception here. So with that, we need to create or use the pragma again. So we need to do the initializing here. So pragma exception init. And then the exception that we will be using, for example, this one, my exception. And then, comma, the error code that we applied. So this one. So like that. So since we have our error message here, so if you want to handle this one in the exception section, so we can just display the SQL ERRM to display the message that, that we created for this kind of error. So let's try to run this one. So we have a line. Let's try to run it. Exception Pragma exception is not supported. Pragma. My exception. Wrong spelling. Yeah. So there you have it. Um, we have our own kind of exception, user-defined exception, which allows us to create our exception like the predefined ones with error code and error message. Yeah. So thank you for watching, guys, and I hope you learned something.